Hello, hello! It is spooky season already here for Kat and I. We know it's a bit early, but we are super excited to get rolling into the actual spooky, scary topics rather than just finding the darkest points in history in seemingly light ones. With that said, this is actually a special episode as we have our very first official guest. Everyone, please give an extremely warm welcome to the author of some pretty amazing spooky stories. Most recently, one called Reluctant Immortals, which looks at what some of the women from popular horror novels might have been doing after their original stories were finished. It's Gwendolyn Kiste! Welcome to the dark side of history, Gwen!
Thank you so much for having me.
So off the bat, why don't you actually tell everyone a little bit about yourself, and give us a bit of an introduction to your relationship with our topic today of the horror genre in both film and literature.
So I'm Gwendolyn Kiste. I'm the author of Reluctant Immortals, The Rust Maidens, Bone Set and Feathers, and I'm a horror writer. That's the main thing that I write, and I've been a horror fan ever since I was a kid. And yeah, I just love it. And this is like the best time of year, right? Because it's, like you said, it's spooky season now. So that's exciting. Happy fall.
Exactly.
We're all here for spooky season.
Yeah, spooky season's like the best season. Who cares about Christmas? And then you've actually won some awards too, right?
Yeah. I'm a 3-time Bram Stoker award-winning author. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you actually decided to use Dracula as part of Reluctant Immortals too.
Yes, Dracula and Jane Eyre, the forgotten women of those books, are the main characters in Reluctant Immortals, so yeah.
I have to say, I did start reading Reluctant Immortals as kind of like gathering a background about like who you are and what you're about, and I got so sucked into it, I had to pull myself out of it to actually get ready for this today. So, I'm really fixing it.
Yeah, Gwen was
That
like,
makes me happy to hear.
Gwen was nice enough to get me like an advanced copy, so I was like reading it over like months. As I'm just like, I can't read too much because I got to do other stuff, but I want to keep going and like make this last as long as possible.
I didn't want to put it down, but I really had to be prepared.
All right.
Thank you. That's always good to hear. That's always what an author wants to hear. So
Exactly. So, being my usual nerdy researcher self, I went and found some interesting stuff about horror in general. Is everyone ready for a little bit of history on the origins?
Yes.
All right. So first of all, let's look at the background behind the word horror itself. So the word is, like most words, derived from Latin. Horror came into our English language through the French, who were living in Britain during the 13th and 14th centuries. It comes from the verb horrere, so Horrere, which has multiple meanings. Basically to bristle/stand up, to shudder/shiver, to tremble with fear, and weirdly enough, to have an unkempt appearance.
An unkempt appearance is enough to be horror.
So the last one does tie in, just bear with me. So the whole bristling part comes from like the original Latin word of horror, which was used to describe the hairs standing up and bristling, usually from the cold back then, which is how we get to the shuddering/shivering part of the definition. Yeah. And it's also how the unkempt appearance got tied into the word, as one might describe someone's messy beard or hair as horrid, because likely there are like hairs sticking out in the same way that they might bristle in the cold.
Gotcha, okay.
So they just were like, we don't want to have a whole other word for this. We'll just tie it all into one. So I got my info on this from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, History of the Word, and they actually added to this information that in 1961, the dictionary added the plural horrors to the synonym delirium tremens, which translates to a violent delirium with tremors.
Okay.
As I'm like, that's getting a little intense.
That does describe it.
Like, I don't think I've ever had a violent delirium with tremors when I'm looking at something with like a horror movie or during like a horror novel. Like, I haven't gotten like that bad.
I think I have. I can think of maybe one or two things that have put me there probably.
I love that.
You're just sitting there and you're just like cowering and just like in a little ball and you're like just like holding yourself so tight that you feel like you're practically shaking because like like you've never like been through not really okay maybe I
I'm
just
over
have too many
flee.
phobias.
In my fight or flee, it's to flee. So as a kid, like anything was horror to me, basically. Like Sleeping Beauty, I was scared shitless of Maleficent that my mom just had to call out Aurora the same way, and I was
she's
gone.
scary, though.
She was scary.
Maleficent's scary. Yeah, I mean, especially when you're a kid, but even as an adult, like I love Sleeping Beauty because I feel like it's kind of like I love the animation, but then also it's like one of the closest to being a horror movie, right? Out of Disney's kind of classic animation, and so it's such horror. So yeah, absolutely.
I mean, now I love Maleficent to death, like, but like as a kid, like Maleficent, Darth Vader, I would freak out. Even now as an adult, I can't watch the original Here Comes Peter Cottontail because the claymation of Iron Tail just creeps the heck out of me.
Okay.
I don't know this. I need to look into this. I don't remember that very well. I need to look into that.
Yeah, like look into it. There is a new version that's like an actual like animated version. That Iron Tail is not as scary. The claymation Iron Tail is freaky as heck.
I loved claymation as a kid, but it did scare me. Claymation is kind of scary to begin with. It moves kind of weird. It looks a little weird. And so anytime you have something that was kind of creepy in claymation, it was extra creepy. At least that's what I always felt as a kid. So I can definitely imagine that. I am looking very forward to looking this up. I don't know that I've seen Peter Cottontail. I've heard of it, but I don't think I've seen it. So okay.
Yeah, no, definitely look it up and see if you can find it because like it's creepy.
Oh, I agree. Claymation has that uncanny kind of vibe about it that like you can take a story that's not particularly scary and make it scary just by putting it in claymation.
Yeah.
I think some people are just like more sort of in tune with that than others. Like it doesn't bother me so much, but I've heard from so many people, like friends, family, acquaintances, that like it really, really creeps them out. And there's something about it that really creeps them out. And I'm just like, I don't really see the problem.
Isn't Nightmare Before Christmas technically like a claymation, but it's a bit more because I think of its timeline of when it was done. It's not as creepy of a claymation because it feels more like action figures than like the actual clay things.
Yeah, that's a good point because I don't even think about it as being claymation, even though you're right, it is. I feel like they were getting the technology down better then. It was a little more like smooth. I think of like the 80s, like that kind of like mid to late 80s, like California raisins seemed to be everywhere during that time. And like they were really bizarre and they kind of creeped me out because it's like, again, that kind of like uncanny sort of quality.
Well, like even some of the kids shows now, I'm like, when my little cousins were watching stuff, I was watching, I'm like, I don't remember kids shows being this creepy as a kid, like when I was a kid. Like, what is up with this modern take on kids shows? That is so scary.
But some of the kids shows that we grew up with, though, you look back and they very much are.
I don't, but I mean, I think because I have like that rose-colored, like those rose-colored glasses on when I look at like the kids shows that I watched.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Well, I think of like Caroline coming out when I was in middle school, and that one is like... That's still terrifying. Like the buttons for eyes is just, ooh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So heading over towards our main topics of horror in film and literature, does anyone have a guess as to when horror stories first started to appear?
Oh, it has to be early on.
Yeah.
Like there must be some tragedies that kind of count as horror.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what you count as horror, right? Because, I mean, you could even say some mythology is horror, and that's, like, super old. So it's like, I'm not really sure when people would have started describing it as a distinct genre. I'm not sure, like, when did it appear in bookstores? Like, this is a viable thing to sell. I actually don't know the answer to that, because I always just think it's, like, always been here, right?
Yeah, so, Gwen, both of you guys are very close. So, it is said that horror stories began to appear basically at the beginning of human history. The origins of horror are rooted in the folklore and religious traditions of our ancient cultures, and elements are even included in the Bible, specifically the Book of Revelation.
Yeah, fair.
European horror fiction can be found in many texts from the ancient Greek and Roman empires. Mary Shelley notably being inspired by one of the texts for Frankenstein, as Kat will know. One that I actually
Freaking love
find
Mary
really
Shelley.
interesting is a tale from the ancient Greek man named Pliny the Younger, which tells of a man who is hesitant to buy a house in Athens due to it being so inexpensive. When he moves in, he is visited by a ghost in chains who disappears into the courtyard, and the next day an unmarked grave is dug up.
Wait, when did that story come out? Because that sounds just
In
like
ancient
so
Greek.
much.
Like in ancient Greece.
Okay. Because that reminds me so much of like The Exorcist and like that trend of movies like of like 80s, 90s that came out that was all like, oh, this young couple bought this house and it turns out to be haunted, and like and it started happening so often it became a trend. Like that reminds me so much of that. So knowing that started in ancient Greece brings me great delight.
Yeah.
I love that.
So it's actually interesting to note what was popular in various parts of the world at the beginning of the horror genre. Apparently, werewolves were extremely popular in France, while in other areas, they mainly became entranced with vampires and murderers. For example, Bluebeard is notably based on the serial killer Gilles de Rais. I won't get into his issues as they're pretty grim, and this episode is not about him. The 18th century saw the rise of romanticized horror and the start of Gothic horror. Most stories at this time were being written by women for women. They usually had a resourceful woman being held, attacked, or scared out of her wits in a gloomy castle. These were ways for female authors to get out their ideas about society at the time. For example, The Italian by Anne Radcliffe had a lot of focus on the issues surrounding the French Revolution, neatly tied into the love story that was brewing. Novels like these were branded as female Gothic rather than male Gothic. So there literally was like a distinction between female and male Gothic literature at the time.
Of course.
But it's actually kind of interesting why, because the main difference is that the quote-unquote supernatural elements in female Gothic novels usually ended up having a very rational explanation, serving to expose the real threats of the world that women in particular needed to be watching out for.
Okay.
So,
whereas male, it would be like purely supernatural, or like
it's usually mainly like supernatural, like there's an actual ghost or an actual vampire or whatever, right? While the women are like, no, we're going to use this form of communication to be like, no, this is what we need to look out for as women.
Interesting.
Yeah. I really recommend Diana Wallace's book, Female Gothic Histories, Gender, History, and the Gothic for a more in-depth look into this subject, because it's actually really interesting how women use their voices and use like the Gothic horror to be able to do that. So moving on to the 19th century, we find the Gothic horror novels that are much more well known and beloved. So we're looking at Frankenstein, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Edgar Allan Poe novels and poems, Picture of Dorian Gray, and of course Dracula. And there are actually a lot of vampire-based novels that came out around this time, which I personally love. But it seemed like the vampire novels actually were like the higher, like in numbers than other horror novels. But I think that the first horror I remember reading was actually Edgar Allan Poe, as I remember memorizing one of his poems from this thin little book that I got from Scholastic, and I actually have the book still. So I found the poem. And it literally goes, deep in the earth, my love is lying, and I weep alone. That's it. So as a kid, I was like, short, sweet, easy to remember. Look, I have a whole Edgar Allan Poe poem in my head, people.
That's great.
So I want to know, what were the first horror novels or poems that you guys actually remember reading?
It was also Edgar Allan Poe. My dad used to recite me The Raven when I was little. So, like, absolutely, it was The Raven. Like, he had it memorized as well. So, like, anywhere we would go, if, like, I remember, like, we were waiting one time on my mom. She was trying to talk to our mechanic because our car was always broken down and it was cold. My dad and I were sitting in the car waiting for her, and he's, like, reciting The Raven to me. So it's like, yeah, that's definitely the first one I remember.
That's so wholesome. No, that's so sweet. Cause see, like my story, I grew up a little sheltered, right? So like I didn't have access to scarier stories until I was in my teens, and then I could start just, choosing what I wanted for myself. And I picked Frankenstein because I was going through a phase of like trying to impress my English teachers like really, really hard. Like where I needed to be the smartest kid in the room at all times. And like pop culture, like Twilight, no thank you. I'll read Frankenstein in my spare time instead. Like it was it was very much a seeking for approval thing. But I genuinely fell in love with it though. Like I picked it up to be not cool. Cool is not the word there, but I picked it up to try to like be intellectual and be mature for my age, and I like genuinely couldn't, like I got sucked into it. Like I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was different from anything else I'd ever tried to read before, and it really started this like, oh wait, no, I genuinely appreciate the classics, and really brought it home. So Frankenstein. Mary Shelley just has a special place in my heart just for that. Yeah. And then I read Frankenstein and then became interested in her as a person. And that's where my like obsession with anything to do with Mary Shelley came in.
I love it. She had such an interesting life. Her life was so fascinating and strange, even for its time. So it's like,
I'm researching it right now and finishing up a script. I promise soon, Ashley, for a soon upcoming podcast episode. So I'm right in the thick of it, and I'm just like, there's so much.
Yeah, because we're doing Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley for an episode. So I got to look into Bram's life, as I'm just like, this is so cool.
Mary Shelley could be her own episode. I've hit page 4 and I'm only in her teens, and there's so much.
Yeah, no, I did the same thing, Kat, like being like an English teacher suck up. Mm-hmm. But I actually genuinely, I did homeschooling, but it was like a distance education homeschooling. So they would send me like about 5 or 6 books and be like, you need to pick like 1 or 2 of these that we're going to send you the course materials on. And I'm like, great, I'll pick the 2 of them, but can I keep the books? Because I still want to read these other books, but I'm going to pick the 2 that I actually feel like I could actually like do my best work on, that I would understand the most to get the good grade, but I want to read these other ones still.
That's great.
Like, but we didn't get to do like any good horror or anything, which was sad.
Yeah. Let's be clear. Frankenstein was not assigned to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was in advanced placement English in grade 11, and it kind of became my personality for a little bit there. And we were told by our English teacher that when we weren't in class, the things that we should be reading shouldn't be like light fluff. Like it should be like the classics and like the deeper literature that had more to say about society. And Frankenstein was on the approved list. And I was like, well, that's a scary story I'm allowed to read, so I'm going to be edgy. And then it just went from there.
I love it. That's great.
Okay. So the 20th century is where horror fiction really got into the swing of things. Rather than publishing full novels right away, writers were serializing their stories in newspapers and other publications. Honestly, I actually think this is kind of genius, because it does kind of build up that suspense where the reader actually has to wait for the next part of the story in order to find out what happens to the characters, etc. Which is kind of like, I like more like the horror, like television series rather than like horror films. Because like I always found like with like American Horror Story and stuff, I actually was more invested because I'm like, okay, now I have to wait for another week to find out this next part. And you always end off on a cliffhanger, right?
Yeah, like it naturally builds up that suspense.
Yeah. So Phantom of the Opera was actually famously done this way. R.I.P. the Broadway stage production that closes in February. I'm like super sad about that, but it's still going to go on the West End.
Yes.
So at least you can still go see it.
We haven't lost it completely.
No, thank God. This is also the period where more and more subgenres were adopted. So we have cosmic horror introduced by H.P. Lovecraft, and then M.R. James redefined the classic ghost story with his works. Serial killers also became huge in the horror genre during this era. As I mentioned in the episode about Bram Stoker, the public were fascinated by the real serial killers like Jack the Ripper, Carl Panzram, and Albert Fish, largely due to the sensationalized journalism that surrounded their crime sprees. It did die down during the wars.
That makes sense.
But popped up again when serial killers like Ed Gein were newsworthy. So his murders were actually the inspiration behind Psycho. And then when the Manson family came on the scene, slasher fiction became popular with the duology Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs in the 1980s. I actually didn't know that Silence of the Lambs was a duology. I only remember watching like the movie. I didn't even know it was like a book series. And I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah. There was a number of them, because then the sequels were also, like, the sequel Hannibal was also based on a book, so yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs, I believe, was also based on Ed Gein, so
Yeah.
lots of creepy real-life inspiration.
It always just adds like an extra layer of ick when it's like based off of like a true story, and then you see like how horrific it is. It's not the same as true crime because they take it and they make it so much worse and like, you know, exaggerate it for film, right? Whereas true crime, you like get the facts and like get the real story. But when you're like kind of blowing it up and turning it into an extra layer of thing, it's like, oh, the capacity of humans to take something bad and make it worse. Like, why do we do this to ourselves?
Well, like, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, okay, before I come on to this part, I do have a pop quiz. There's only one question, don't worry. Who are considered the king and queen of horror writing?
Stephen King's the king.
Yeah, I would assume
Yeah.
Stephen King. Anne Rice and Stephen King.
Actually, Shirley Jackson is considered the queen because she's the
She's
one
my
who...
queen.
Yeah, I know, right?
I assumed that, you know.
Because
Say Mary Shelley. I feel like any of those would work.
yeah, but I think most people consider Shirley Jackson as the queen because she inspired so many of the more of like the later authors. So then they're like, because she's like the inspiration, we're going to consider her the queen of horror writing.
I feel like Mary Shelley I'd consider the mother more than I'd consider the queen.
Interesting. I like
Yeah.
that.
But no, I wanted to do that pop quiz first because I was going to say, like, Stephen King is really good with taking, like, the real life events and not sensationalizing them over the top. Because
I know, I agree. I think he can.
he can,
you
but,
know.
like, I'm thinking of, like, Mr. Mercedes, right?
Yeah.
That one is one where he took the idea of somebody driving a car into a crowd of people as like a terrorist action and stuff, right? And then you're looking more into the people who are trying to catch up, and you're kind of getting that dual point of view of the perpetrator and the and the detective that's on the hunt. And
Or
I liked how you did that.
Yeah, for the first book in the series, I'd agree with that. I think by the end it got a little sensationalized.
But at
when he
the end, it
started
was
bringing
not
in
great. But like the first book, I'm like, he did a really good job.
Yeah.
Like that's like the
by
number
end of
one. I
the
think.
series, it went back to being supernatural, and it's like, all right, this is sensational again. But like, you know, it was.
I think I read like halfway through the second book, and then I'm like, I can't. Like, it's not as good as the first book. Like, dude, one book and done.
Although I will say the series, like, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the whole thing. But yeah, but that's also because, oh no, I'm blanking on her name. First one of the episode I got so far. Her name, give me one
Google.
second. Google, frantically Googling. They didn't change her name in the series, did they? Holly, not Haley. Holly Gibney. Oh my goodness, I loved her.
I don't know this. I have to look into this. I haven't read these books yet, so.
It was turned into a movie series as well, which from what I've heard, I didn't have time to sit down and watch it, but from what I've heard, it does a really good job of representing what the book very accurately. So also an option.
Didn't Stephen King also kind of like where he has like a lot more of a heavy hand into his work adaptations, kind of like how like Nicholas Sparks and stuff like that, like they have like their own published like production companies so that they can make sure that the books are done justice, kind of a thing.
I would say that he does more so now than with some of the
Oh,
older
yeah.
adaptations of his books. He did not like The Shining, but like
Yeah.
But I love The Shining.
I know, but he didn't like what
No.
they turned either into, and honestly fair. So
I mean,
Just looking up the adaptation for Mr. Mercedes, like from 2017. I don't really remember it even being a series. So yeah.
I think there's 3 books in the book
it's like
series.
3.5 because there's a short story that Holly Gibney participates in as well.
Yeah.
Kind of tagged on to the end. That shows up in, what was it?
Was it like one of his newer short story adaptations?
Yeah, it was a collection of short stories. I read it and I don't remember what it's called. Which one was it?
I've kind of like pulled back from reading like anything new of Stephen King's just because I'm like, it's so hit or miss that I'm like, I'm just gonna stick with like the ones that I actually like, that I know I like, and I'm not gonna bother continuing and stuff, right? Where then I'm like, I don't even want to read the ones that I do like.
I mean, to be fair, the man writes so much that it's not like, you know, when you're writing that many books, not every single one of them is going to be a work of pure genius. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's true. It's like so many books that, yeah. I don't even try to keep up with everything Stephen King's doing anymore because it's like, you know, I feel like I'll just drive myself crazy, so.
It's kind of like trying to keep up with like James Patterson, who has like 5 books a year.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy. That's so many. That's so much.
Well, he doesn't write them, so he just does like the outline and then is like, here, you write it.
Are we really?
Ghostwriters, yeah.
Are we using this episode to call it James Patterson Shameless Ghostwriters?
Yes.
Shamelessly ghostwriting.
I had during one of my, I think it was either my children's or my YA lit course for library tech, I had my childhood ruined, even though I kind of already knew, by the teacher for saying like, these books weren't written by these authors. They were literally factory written. And I'm just like, but. I'm like, I even knew it. Like, I had that inkling. No, like, but I was like, I don't want to actually hear it.
That's funny. Yeah, you know, I don't know. I'm trying to remember back to like the series I would read when I was a kid, and I never really thought that much about it until like I got older about them being ghost written. But like I don't feel like I got as attached to authors, so I wasn't like it didn't. You know, I'm trying to think back. Like I do believe, and okay, maybe I'm being really naive. I think R.L. Stine does write his stuff, right? I don't think it's ghost written.
I think it is his. I think it is his.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And I read that when I was a kid. And now I'm thinking like I read Christopher Pike's stuff because like they were hand-me-down books like from my older cousins. And I'm not sure about Christopher Pike now. Now I'm curious, were those ghost written? I don't think so, but I'm not sure. So yeah, like I don't know. And then other things like I read like The Babysitter's Club and like Boxcar Children.
Mm-hmm.
You guys, I think, did you guys read that? Because I think you guys are younger than me, so I'm not sure. Like,
I read those.
No, I definitely read those. I remember, like, I think it was the very last Babysitter's Club book, where Marianne has a fire in the house and then she's saving her kitten from the fire. I literally remember sitting in front of my bookcase and I had like a pile of stuff like around me, kind of a thing, like where it's like, this is my reading spot. And I was just like going through a pile of my Babysitter's Club in order. And I got to that book. And I just remember, literally remember vividly just sitting there bawling my eyes out. And my mom coming in and going, "Are you okay, honey?" And I'm like, "I'm fine." She's like, "Well, what's wrong?" I'm like, "Marianne's saving her kitten from a fire." And I was like, "Okay, I'm leaving now."
Oh no!
Did she save it? Spoiler, did she save it?
Oh yeah. It's a Babysitter's Club. They're not going to kill a kitten.
Yeah, I know. Babysitter's Club was not that kind. That was one of the things I liked about them. I always hated as a kid that I would like read a book and like then the animal would die at the end or one of the main characters would die at the end. And I'm like, no, I didn't just get through all this. I didn't just put in all this time and energy and emotion and then you're going to kill off some character and like teach me a lesson as the reader. I'm like, no. And that was one of the things I liked about like the Babysitter's Club or the Boxcar Children or some of these is like they were predictable in terms of like nobody's gonna die at the end. Like a kitten's not gonna get killed. Like if you had said yes, Marianne's kitten got killed, I'd be like, whoa, the Babysitter's Club got weird at the end.
Good turn. No. We had the Babysitters Club's books. My older sister and my mom liked them a lot, and I never really did get into them because it just wasn't my style, wasn't my vibe. But yeah, I think I did. I always wanted the scarier books, but I had such restricted access. The only scary books that I was allowed to read were like the Left Behind series, which is a Christian. So it's based on Revelations. It's Christian fiction for children, and it's dark. It is dark. There's an adult version, and then there's a teen version, and the teen version was the one I was allowed to read, and it was okay in my family because it was Christian, because it's based on the symbology in Revelations, and like, what if that happened literally on Earth?
Oh, Lord.
And it was nightmare inducing. Like, it was nightmare fuel.
Yeah, Revelations was scary. I remember reading it, like reading that part of the Bible as a kid and being like, this is like a horror movie. This is terrifying. This is apocalyptic horror. It's
yeah.
I never read it.
Horror is actually based off of it. It or ties back to it in one way or another.
Yeah.
It's
absolutely.
Cool.
I just remember thinking
Right.
how cool I was because I had like the Darren Shawn, like the Vampire's Assistant and his other horror series. And I think a couple of the covers had like glow in the dark. So like the teeth or whatever would glow and different things. And I remember where I'm like, even if I wasn't reading that one at the time, I always put it on the top of my stack so that while I'm going to bed, I'm like, oh, look at me, I'm so cool. I can handle having like this glow in the dark horror cover right beside my bed and I'm not having a panic attack. I'm just like,
this is totally
okay, but you're
fine.
having a panic attack still, thinking that the house is going to burn down because a sock made it onto the heat register. Like, you're still having panic attack, just not about that.
Yeah. No, it's good. Like, you're testing yourself. I like it.
Okay.
Right.
So, with some of the history in our back pockets and a bit more of an idea about like the subgenres in horror, I wanted to know what you guys both gravitate towards. I personally love like the psychological horror and gothic horror the most. I want to be tricked into the hair-raising feelings. Kind of like with like Shirley Jackson and her works and stuff, right? I want to constantly be wondering what's going to happen and who is the real scary entity that needs to be battled. Like, other forms are great, but I don't get that same thing from like cosmic or slashers and res. Like, you know that there's somebody slashing at you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like gothic horror. I think gothic horror is one of my favorites. And I like how you talk about the psychological horror. I think almost like domestic horror like in haunted houses or horror like around the house, or it's like, you know, the horror's coming from within the family or something like that. Something like you said that has that kind of realistic element to it, even if there's supernatural elements as well. Of, you know, does feel much more relatable and it does feel more immediate. When cosmic horror that I've liked, or when I have written cosmic horror, I very often like to kind of like either read things or again write things that focus more on specific people rather than this idea of like, oh, you know, it's this big giant, you know, the end of the world. Like, to me, it's more scary and more like something I can be drawn into when it's like specific people going through things as opposed to like, you know, here's Cthulhu. No offense to Cthulhu. But like, it doesn't really scare me that much. It just doesn't. Because also, one of the things that I think makes horror, you know, appealing to me is the idea that you maybe can defeat the bad guy or the bad force, or that you can get out of it. Cthulhu comes down, you're doomed. That's it. It's over. Like, Cthulhu's gonna win. How you gonna beat Cthulhu? So it's less scary, even though it's worse in a lot of ways, because it's like there's not gonna be the same struggle. You're doomed. That's it.
Like, you just have to accept it.
You know, exactly. And so with like a haunted house story or something gothic, it's like you may be able to kind of go against, you know, whatever that force is. You may be able to win, and that brings that tension, and it also makes it scarier because maybe you'll lose as well. So
yeah, no, I like that aspect of gothic horror as well, how it like focuses down to like usually just like a small group of people are affected by this thing, and there are a set of rules. You don't know them all at the beginning, but there's a set of rules that you have to follow in order to defeat the thing. Like with vampire lore, right? Like, you know, depending on which lore you're following, it's like it's got to be a stake to the heart, or it's got to be like the holy communion cracker, or like, you know, like it's got to be like there's very specific rules, and if you can find the right person with the right knowledge and the right information, that head knowledge can can save you, can like save your life in that instance. So I like stuff like that where it's about like it's not about being the strongest in the room like in an action movie or like in an action adventure. It's about being the smartest in the room, and it's about knowing the right things. And I vibe with that, maybe a little too hard. So
I like that.
so, and I feel like that same thing kind of translates into psychological horror for me. Like with more modern psychological horror, it's maybe not like gothic and doesn't follow the same kind of monster, like same kind of tropes and things like that. But with psychological horror, it's still like you play your cards right, you trick the right person, you sly your way out of there. More so than just like, brute forcing your way out.
Yeah. Well, because like what I like about like the psychological horror and stuff is there's not always that there's an outside force. Kind of like with We've Always Lived in the Castle with Shirley Jackson. There's not an outside force keeping them in the house.
Yeah.
It's herself. Like she is the one doing the trapping, and that's and stuff, right? Like you actually have to look inside yourself to figure out how am I going to get through this or whatever, right? Or then going like, oh my god, wait, could this happen to me?
Yeah, that's a big aspect of it too, especially for like I like watching psychological thrillers like in movies a lot. I'm not a big fan of the jump scares, but I'm a big fan. If you can make me feel like this could be real, then you will get under my skin faster than anything else. So things going into the spiritual realm, I won't even touch it because I don't want to mess with that. Like that's just like we're just not even going to try to wrap my head around that right now. But like but things like Jordan Peele's Us, like that one was like earth shaking for me because I was like, but what if it's true though? like I can't prove that it's not like stuff like that where it's like it's got that element of realism enough, even if it is like there's something crazy, something else going on. If it's got that element of like, okay, but this could be real, like this is how people would react, like this could be real. That's the stuff that like freaks me out the most. I was thinking about that movie for weeks afterwards. Like it was
the like underground lab part of it. That's what like freaked you out. Mm-hmm.
It was the way that Lupita played her character, and with like the eyes and just the whole I don't know. It's just the whole eeriness of thinking about like actively controlling someone else into doing things that hurt them and not knowing. It's just that whole thing, I think.
Yeah.
I like that. That's interesting. It's a good point. Yeah.
Right?
In my notes, I did have that, like where I was, like, saying, like, now what makes something horror, right? And so, right, and, like, one of the things is that scholars have come to the conclusion that if it's going to be considered horror, it needs to provoke an emotional, psychological, or physical response that causes a reader to react with fear. And that one of the best quotes about this comes from H.P. Lovecraft. And it goes, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. So, like, the fact that, like, it's the unknown that's creeping the heck out of people, and especially, like, you guys, like, that is literally pretty much what defines horror in a way.
Like, that's what it really boils down to.
Right? Because I want to know, like, why do we want to be scared? Why would we put ourselves through that, right? Chelsea White's essay in The New Scientist gave a really amazing quote that says that people who like horror films are more likely to score high for openness to experience, a personality trait linked to intellect and imagination.
No.
And stuff, right? Where I'm like, my imagination is literally what screwed me over big time as a kid. Like, that I couldn't handle a lot of things because my imagination would go wild with it.
That's such like an ironic thing, I feel like, for any of us who suffer from anxiety. It is the imagination, right?
Yeah.
It's imagining all these different terrifying scenarios in which we'll die or be maimed or lose something that we want. And yeah, absolutely. Anxiety, like in order to have a lot of anxiety, I imagine you have to have a lot of imagination. So that can obviously go in good and bad ways to have
Yeah.
imagination.
Well, because like that's what I find. Like I can read horror much easily than I could ever watch horror, right? And I think that that's because like my reading style is more of the feeling. I'm not
Okay.
one that when I'm reading, I'm actually seeing things that are happening. Like that's not how my
Can't relate.
imagination goes. Like there are people who
Okay.
literally will be reading a book and they can see it as if it's a movie, right? I am more
Yeah, that's
feeling,
right.
right?
Okay.
That
Interesting.
and I think that's why I like Shirley Jackson so much. Is that all of her books are about how you're feeling while you're reading it. So like
Okay.
I loved at my family house, our living room was kind of like a sunken in living room, and then it had like the roof that during a storm you could really hear the wind, the rain, and everything. So my favorite thing would be to curl up in the middle of the night with The Haunting of Hill House and just read that while listening to the storm around me because I would actually get that really good feeling from the book. But I think that for me, like seeing it, then my imagination would go even more wild because I'm actually literally seeing things happening,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I actually see the character rather than just feel like, oh, there's something behind me, whatever.
Okay.
Same thing like when
Yeah.
I went to Fright Nights at
Yeah.
and stuff, right? Like we have like a thing every Halloween where
At the Peony in Vancouver.
like where like our playland like theme park kind of thing turns into like a horror zone basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I went for the first time and I was perfectly fine because I'm like, okay, I can see everybody, things are great.
Mhm.
But then one of the characters came walking up in like towards us and was just like hello, and we're like hi, and then just out of the corner of my eye he did like a snake-like motion towards me and I was gone. As I'm like, nope, done, can't handle this, we're leaving, goodbye. Because then like I was on that most like that fear, like that flight constantly, that I'm like I can't handle this because I could see it happening out of the corner of my eye. And that's what I think makes it that horror movies are way harder for me, is that I can actually see the things happening.
Mm-hmm. See, for me, the thing is, my fight, flight, fawn, or freeze response is to fight, and like not necessarily physically fight, but like take action, right? Like I go into the thing, right? So I went to Fright Night at the Peony for the very first time with just one friend. So it was just two of us, you know, young, 19, I think, year old, these tiny little girls that are like wandering around this place by ourselves. Skipped to the clown section because that was absolutely going to be a no. And then, even though one of my friends was working there as an actor, as a clown, I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to see you. I'm just going to go straight by. Like, that's not happening. We were like doing all right. We're like, okay, like the actors everywhere, they're really cool. We're trying to focus on like how cool their makeup is and stuff like that. And then one creeps up behind me and said, just like, they had like a big prosthetic face that was like all like twisted and weird and kind of like impressionist, and came up behind me and kind of startled me, and I swung around and like clenched my fist like I was gonna swing, and then realized that was not gonna be okay, stopped myself and just said hi in like the cheeriest voice, and he just like walked away because he was like, oh, I didn't spook her. And I was like, you terrified me, sir. Like so we spent the rest of that was our immediate response for the rest of it. Anytime we walked, they had like a zone that was all based on like classic movie villains. So they had like Freddy Krueger with like the slicey fingers, and like and so we're walking through them and everything, and we're just like, hi, how's it going? I'm like, hi, nice to meet you. Like and just being dumb and being the exact kind of people that the monster actors absolutely hate, because we were just being goofy and silly and not taking it seriously and not getting freaked out at all.
Yeah, I was
After you
thankful.
were very freaked out. so
After
that's
I
good.
was, yeah.
When I went,
Which was the first time.
the movie actors all stayed like in like a pod, so I just listened constantly for the sound of the chainsaw as I'm like, hey, do not go that direction. Oh wait, they're coming this way, which direction are we going to turn? So that I'm like, I know that if I see one of them, especially the one with the chainsaw, that's going to send me over the edge.
Fair enough. My friend, one of the monsters, we started walking because there was like a dollhouse haunted house that we wanted to go through, but we had to go through like a smoke machine in order to get there. And so we start walking towards it, and one of them like piped up. I don't even know which one, but one of them piped up, going, "Yes, go into the fog." And my friend's like, "Okay," and started skipping towards it. Like it was. It lightened the situation, and it made it not scary enough for us to actually see all the things and enjoy all the things. So we just kept doing it. It worked.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a good segue now into let's look at horror films.
All right.
Oh, actually,
Sure.
Gwen, did you have anything you wanted to add about like literature and stuff, and like even like from the point of view of somebody who writes horror?
Yeah, I think for me, I actually think I find reading horror to be scarier than watching it. I think because watching it, like, I can turn it off, and obviously I can stop reading, but I'm creating the images in my own mind as opposed to the images being created. So I feel like that, not that I've never been unnerved or scared by a horror film, I have, but I feel like for me, like reading it, and it also is more intimate to read, right? Like you can watch a film with like 200 people at a time, right? In a movie theater or however many people. When you're reading, it's just between you and the book. And like no two readers will ever read something quite the same way. Like we're getting slightly different images or we're getting slightly different reactions. So it feels very much like it's between me and this book. And that, that kind of barrier is, less than between me and a movie, which I know. I also was an independent filmmaker for a period of time. So it's like to some extent, and I made horror films. So to some extent, you kind of watch it from that perspective of like, okay, how did they do this effect? Or, I've seen other movies by this same director. And so kind of looking at it like that, whereas with horror literature, I feel like it's just, I go more into it and it's more just between me and the book. And so I feel like I've been creeped out more by horror literature than maybe horror films, but obviously love them both. So
That's actually kind of
That
interesting.
actually, I had a question about that. As a writer who writes horror films, do you ever get like spooked by your own work, by like the things that you write as you're writing it?
every once in a while, and especially when I used to write when I was like at home by myself. Like my husband works from home now, so we're always, together. So maybe not quite so much now because it's like never that kind of isolation. But I know there have been times, that I've written something and then I'm by myself and I'm like, oh, why did I do this? Why did I write this when I was home alone? This is kind of freaking me out now. So yeah, occasionally, definitely, but like, maybe not all the time. Because like I said, once you know the mechanics of it, the same thing when I would make, when I was, a horror filmmaker, or I did some acting in other people's horror films. You're not really scared when you're on a set for the most part. Or at least you shouldn't be. Every once in a while you hear of actors being terrorized on sets, and I'm like, that's really not how that's supposed to go. You don't need that kind of method acting of terrorizing actors. But like, yeah, so it's like, I feel like when you're the creator and you're kind of knowing the mechanics and the architecture behind it, maybe it's not quite as scary. But every once in a while I do still freak myself out. And I'm like, oh, hopefully that'll freak out other people too.
If it scares you, then it's got to scare at least one other person, right?
Right? Yeah.
I find that actually really interesting because like when I will be working on like a bit more of like a scarier short story or like a horror-ish short story, like I find that I'm like the least scared. And I think because I'm like, I have control over it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm the most scared if it's something that's actually happening in person. Because I'm like, when we go to like Fright Nights or like the haunted horror mazes and stuff like that, I'm like, you don't know who's behind that mask. Like, it could be somebody who's like, I'm just going to don this now while I'm in here, and boom, I'm going to actually actively harm people. Where I'm like, you never know.
I'm actually really curious now that you mentioned it about how many times that's happened.
I don't think it's happened very often. I did do research on that, and I'm pretty sure that it hasn't happened very often. Okay. But like that's like one of the things, like I hate clowns in person because I'm like, I don't know who's behind that clown makeup. Anyone can put on makeup. And clowns are just creepy in general.
Clowns are just, Clowns, I saw a thing, I'm sidetracked, like getting us derailed again a little bit. But clowns, I saw a thing, it's a while ago, so I don't have a source for this on hand. But it was saying that clowns are creepy because we can tell it's disingenuous. Because when they have like the painted smile and you can see that the person's real smile underneath is not that exaggerated and is not that genuine smile, then you like your brain is really, really good at detecting lies, right? And like finding patterns and finding the fault in the pattern. And so if their smile doesn't match up with that hyper exaggerated look, then your brain is picking up on that and going, they're wrong, it's wrong, it's bad, it's wrong. And like, and that's where that like, you make me uncomfortable feeling comes from. Yeah, right?
I have like next to no opinion on clowns. Like none. And I've always found it like interesting because I don't really particularly like them. I don't particularly dislike them. I don't feel like I'm particularly scared of them.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I'm not sure why that is. I don't know like why I never formed an opinion on clowns. I almost feel like I'm missing out. Like either I should like really be like, no, I'm gonna be a clown defender, or like be like, no, they're totally creepy, and instead just I have like no opinion.
I can tell you that the clown community likes people like you, because I was volunteering at the local museum and we were doing a wedding exhibit, and one of our local clown, the community clowns, brought in her wedding outfit because she got married as a like in a clown kind of outfit. Like she was that dedicated, and she came in like without her clown stuff on and was talking to us, and so she was saying how she hates like the horror industry for making clowns so scary and stuff, because now like, there's so many people who are scared of clowns. And I'm like looking at her, I'm like, even you in regular stuff, and I'm creeped out by you. Because like I've had her at like other jobs of mine where she's come in to like to do events and stuff, and then I'm like trapped in a booth and she's singing opera and stuff like and like like there's nobody else around, and I'm like, what are you doing? Get away from me!
Clown lady in clown makeup or not is like terrorizing the community.
Yeah. And like it was actually weird because like my ex, his mom was one of the community clowns as well. And she had cancer, and so I went to support because they had like a community fundraiser thing for her, and so there's like a pile of clowns there. I'm like, I'm here to support you and only you. Just get me out of here though as soon as possible. I do not like that there's like 5 clowns in the same room as me.
This is so interesting that like you know clowns. Like I've never like met somebody who dresses up like a clown. Like maybe maybe I know somebody who's been like a clown for Halloween, but to know people who are just like clowns for fun in their spare time year round, like that's part of it. I haven't had much exposure to clowns except through like media, and but maybe if I'd been around actual in-person clowns to some extent, I'd have an opinion. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, like the same ex, he would dress up as the Joker, and I could handle him as the Joker perfectly fine.
I don't even know if the Joker really counts as a clown so much as just his own entity as a thing now by this point. Because he's so unique and so identifiable.
Yeah, you're right. Because when you said the Joker, I'm like, yeah, he's a clown, I guess. But like, I've never really considered, even though obviously, it's clown makeup, but I agree. I think he's something separate that's clown inspired.
Yeah.
But not necessarily what I would consider a clown. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think he's evolved from that at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know personally my clown thing is kind of like my antique doll thing, where it wasn't a thing until a certain movie made it a thing. I was more like you. I didn't have an opinion on clowns until I watched it. And then I had an opinion on clowns.
Oh, I always had an opinion.
A lot of people have that story, but yeah.
Same thing with the doll thing. I didn't have a problem with dolls. They were just kind of there. Actually, my own grandmother, bless her heart, she collects dolls, like antique dolls. And then I watched Annabelle, and I've never looked at them the same way again. They went from being very, very innocent, oh, my grandmother's house, to being, oh, absolutely not. We're not doing that.
But see, like, I think that's like a cool difference, because I'm like, I am afraid of clowns to the point that I don't want to go near them.
Yeah.
But I am afraid of, like, I'm also afraid of, like, dolls, especially dummies, like the ventriloquist dummies and stuff like that. Like, even if we have, like, a puppeteer coming and doing an event, I'm like, you stay away from me, you're creeping the hell out of me. But I'm more intrigued about those ones that I'm like, I actually want to see these more. Because I'm in, like, I actually like the fear of them.
Okay.
Right? Like, if I could get my hands on an actual haunted doll, I'd be so happy to have one of those in my house.
Absolutely not.
But not a haunted clown. Hell no.
No, I don't want anything haunted. The haunted objects can stay away from me. No thanks. I'm also not somebody who's ever going to say Bloody Mary 3 times in a mirror.
Yes.
Oh, I've done it.
Why risk it?
Nothing's going to happen, which you could just not do anything and have the same thing. The worst case scenario, something will happen, and why the heck do I want to do that?
Right?
Well, I
Same
did see
page.
a meme yesterday that I loved that I'd never thought of before. They said something like, say Bloody Mary 3 times into like your car's mirror as you're driving and make her like run to catch up. And I'm like, I had never thought about the fact that different mirrors would appear in different places. And that was funny. That made me laugh. I still wouldn't do it because if she catches up with you, then she's going to be extra mad.
But then also, is she behind you or is she in the mirror? Which one is true? Does she come out of the mirror? Like, how does the technicalities of this, how does this all work? What are the rules? I don't know and I don't understand it. It scares me.
Yeah, no, I'm not messing around with that. Like, no.
No, same page. I would never.
Like a with me and my husband because we like love supernatural stuff, and I like asked him like, "Did you ever do Bloody Mary in a mirror?" He's like, "No, like I don't want to deal with that." I'm like, "Okay, good. Like this is good. We're on the same page. Like this is important stuff to ask somebody before you get married. Would you or would you not say Bloody Mary in a mirror? Because we need to be on the same page with this stuff."
Are you going to curse our household or are we safe?
Exactly.
Yeah, see, my fiance and I, we would both say, yeah, we would do it, because we probably both have done it.
At least you're on the same page, though. See, it's still good. You're on the same page, so whatever. Like, you know, different choices, but good for you guys.
At least it's not like one of you is going to do it and the other one is going to be like, why are you doing this?
Yeah, the tension in a horror movie is always like a couple that does that. It's always, if you're on the same page, there's no tension. You're not the ones in the horror movie.
Oh, man. All right, so now that I've completely derailed, I should be...
That's a running theme, though. We have to derail, or this is not one of our podcast episodes.
It really wouldn't be. All right, so films, much like horror stories, in the sense that horror stories have been around ever since stories have been around. From the conception of film, we've also had horror stories. One of the first horror stories, possibly the first horror story or horror film being credited to Le Manoir. I am Canadian. My French should be better than it is, but it isn't. So here we are. Le Manoir de Diable in 1896. I'm so sorry for that pronunciation. In the US, it was known as The Haunted Castle, which I can pronounce. And in the UK, it was known as The Devil's Castle. It included themes that were already present in literary horror, namely ghosts, demons, and haunted castles. It was very much Gothic horror inspired, and early inspirations largely mimicked literature, and a lot of the early horror movies were book adaptations. So we had the director, George, I looked up how to pronounce this, I researched it. Méliès was a master of visual and practical effects, and that earned him a spot in film history. His innovations in early special effects were revolutionary, and this kind of trick videography would be adopted by other creators and eventually become so standard that we largely overlook it now. So these are effects like scenes fading in and out, overlapping dissolve, so like being able to have like the same person in two different spots on the screen reacting to each other, and split screen.
Yeah, because this was like during like the silent film era, right? Like
very early stuff, very, very early stuff. Kind of set the basis for like what you can start to do with special effects, and kind of spurs that creativity about like, okay, so we figured out how to do this. How do we do other things, and like continue it on? Also very early on, we had a silent film adaptation of Frankenstein produced in 1919. The Student of Prague, a German silent horror film, which was loosely based on a short story by Edgar Allan Poe. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was one of the most popular book-to-film adaptations in early film, and it was made 3 times in the 1920s alone by 3 different producers, all jumping onto that cash cow at the same time.
I think isn't that kind of like now, like as soon as you have like a film adaptation, like if it wasn't for getting like the rights, that only one person at a time can have like the rights to a lot of stuff, but like as soon as it becomes public domain, it's just like everybody's gonna jump on it at the same time.
Yep. Same thing. We've always been doing this. We just have different rules now. Yeah, so Universal was the biggest horror film production company in the late 20s and early 30s with their adaptations of Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy, all looking for the quick success offered by using the pre-established titles. Use a title that's popular enough, you're going to get people coming in and watching it. All right, so Universal then went on to make Dracula's Daughter and The Son of Frankenstein, which sped up the production of horror films for the 1940s. Tropes at this point had started to become well established, and as the 40s went on, started to feel a little uninspired, and the genre began to parody itself. So producer Val Lewton was hired by RKO Pictures around this time and was given free rein to do what he wanted within a very, very tight budget. So with not being able to afford the Gothic castles and the elaborate scenery and the elaborate costumes of the decade past, he was kind of forced to try something new. He wasn't able to use the same tropes because he didn't have access to a lot of what he needed for them. And he ended up innovating and kind of bringing in a new variety of terror, relying on things that we're much more accustomed to now. Things like setting a more suspenseful tone, the use of music to set the mood, and simpler and more kind of everyday type settings, a farmer's field rather than a Gothic castle, for example. He produced The Body Snatcher and Cat People, which popularized the cat scare, a trope in which there's a high buildup of tension before it's quickly released by something harmless, such as a cat darting across an alley.
He also did I Walked with a Zombie, which is a Jane Eyre adaptation. It's Jane Eyre horror, so.
Yeah, so lots of good films, lots of, yes.
I just like that Universal was like one of like the main horror production teams when like I think most of the time when you think of like the horror like walkthroughs and stuff now, like you think of like Universal Studios horror stuff that they do for like the month of October, right? Like they're like the number one.
Like practical effects haunted houses and
yeah, well, and just like the scale of what they do, because I remember one year I wanted to go because they did like what if the Wicked Witch of the West had won in The Wizard of Oz. Like they got some really cool, like they got like some amazing people and their ideas for this stuff.
Yeah, so you know, makes sense that they'd be doing that now if some of their earlier films were largely horror films. And so this brings us to the end of the 40s and into the 50s, which was a wild time. We'd seen the effects of nuclear weapons, and the extinction of mankind was a very common fear. And societal fears translate into horror movies really, really well. So what we ended up seeing were things like atomic monsters like Godzilla, who made his debut in the 50s, along with a string of similar monsters, you know, giant ants, giant spiders, like exaggerated things, scientific experiments gone wrong, man-made monsters, and alien takeovers, which were all common themes for like a period during this time. We also see in the 50s a lot more gimmicky filmmaking. Things like 3D films and audience effects, like with The Tingler, in which filmmaker William Castle put buzzers in theater seats that were set to go off whenever the Tingler appeared on screen so that the audience would experience what the victims were supposed to be experiencing. Which is like, what?
I love that idea though.
Yeah.
Like immersion.
A lot of really gimmicky stuff like that. It's just a lot of fun.
Well, I think immersion is like a key part in a horror film, right? Because like you're just watching it on the screen, so then you're like that step removed. But if you can actually like immerse yourself, like with the buzzers, or I saw Cabin in the Woods at the drive-in, that's in the woods basically. So like that actually made it a bit more scary because I'm literally in woods, like surrounded. Yeah.
You know, that immersion is so important, and things like 3D and like stuff like this very much do pull you into it. I just thought it was funny when I was looking into this because I remember back in, it must have been probably 2010s. I remember my sister being in high school and theaters talking about like 4D movies where it would have like seats that had like sticks that would poke you in the back, and like you'd hear like twigs snap from underneath your feet, or you'd get sprayed with bubbles or sprayed with water, or like physical practical effects. You're essentially like signing up for like a roller coaster in a theater, like. So I remember that being like a big trend then again, and I'm like, okay, so it didn't start there. Like You know, I thought that the more like modern 3D film, like I thought that was much more recent than like the 50s. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, because it was big in the 50s, and then I think it came back. I know the third Jaws movie was Jaws 3D, and one of the Friday the 13th movies was a 3D movie, because you can tell, like, because, like, at one point, I think, like, an eye or something pops out at the screen. Like, you can a lot of times tell that even when they're not 3D, like, that version that they were, because if stuff keeps coming at the screen, it's like, oh, that was, like, the 3D thing. So, yeah, like, it's a... 3D is an interesting thing because it seems to like come and go, because it definitely about 10 years ago was like a thing again. All of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, we're going to do Avengers 3D. We're going to do this thing 3D. And and then like it just goes again. Probably another 10 or 20 years we're going to have 3D again. And hopefully like it won't be, because it was like those glasses, they kind of give me a headache. Like I'm not a big fan. So hopefully they'll like figure out a way to like make it a little bit better next time around.
Watch as it's like augmented reality 3D or like VR 3D or something like that.
No,
time.
then
Like,
you're getting like
I wouldn't be
nauseous.
surprised.
I don't want to puke during my horror movie. Like that's gonna take me right out of it.
By then.
But no, like I remember
But
seeing
I can see that, though.
Nightmare on Elm Street in 3D, like the newer, like when they redid it and then they put it in 3D. And I wasn't as scared of it. Like, I did not have nightmares after seeing it in 3D. But watching, like, the original, and I would have nightmares afterwards.
Interesting.
So it's kind of weird.
Yeah, I think it's so gimmicky. I actually feel like I'm taken out of it. It's more just like a fun thing to do. Like, if you're into it. But I definitely have never been afraid of, like, oh my gosh, it's like you're already aware something's different. Like, this is not the way you normally see things. So I feel like you're kind of, again, putting up a barrier between the audience and the film. But mileage may vary, as I always say. I'm sure somebody out there is like, nope, totally creepier.
Well, maybe it might heighten some of the jump scares because it's actually kind of coming more towards you, right? But other than that, I'm like,
yeah,
like okay.
No, I could see that. I could totally see the intent being immersion and the effect being like, this is silly light fun now. Like, yeah. So yeah,
like the Halloween cat back there.
This is Ash. She's my kitty.
Simba's somewhere now in the house.
Yeah, we just got her little catnip cat toys that are little pumpkins, and they're so cute. And it's just she's adorable, and I love her very much. So 3D was actually on a downward trend by the time The Creature of the Black Lagoon came out. It was filmed in 3D, kind of like at the height of this trend, but as we've discussed, this trend tends to cycle pretty quickly. But by the time it was released, audiences weren't as interested in it anymore, and they were like preferred to watch it in 2D. So between between it being filmed and between it coming out, already the interest had already declined enough that audience didn't want to see it in 3D after all. Coming to the end of the 50s, in 1957, Frankenstein was once again adapted to film as The Curse of Frankenstein, now with more gore and violence that didn't go over well with critics, but the audience loved it. And the graphic violence had formally been introduced to horror and revived Gothic horror. So this came back in the 60s. We see it a little bit more with some Gothic horror kind of resurging here. So the 60s rewrote the horror film genre forever with the release of Psycho in 1960, and started bringing us to the trend of psychological horror films where the villain was a serial killer, which would eventually lead to the rise of slasher films. So classic movie monsters also had a violent resurgence here, and we see more blood and more sex start to appear in horror. Gore became more and more popular throughout the 60s. You cannot be playing with pencils while we're doing this, Fluff. She likes to get in the way every time. Yeah, so gore became more and more popular throughout the 60s, and it was a slow process where violence started with like fast editing to just kind of imply it until production companies got brave enough to show the killings, blood and all. The breakthrough film for this being The Night of the Living Dead. Now, that's not to say that we've never seen death on screen before, but we've never seen death on screen like this.
Yeah.
So, horror coming in with Rosemary's Baby horror had started making an appearance here. That keep you guessing, is this supernatural or is this just people being awful? So Films in the later 70s and early 80s became massive hits in part to theme music. These are films like Jaws and Halloween. It was also the type of killer that made these horror films the most memorable, as we got Michael Myers, Freddy, and Jason. This is the dawn of the slasher film franchise. There was also a rise of animal-based horror movies, which I find interesting around this time, including Grizzly and a number of like beach shark themed based movies that were riding off the popularity of Jaws. So
I think all I can ever remember from Jaws really is the theme music.
I was dumb when I watched Jaws. I watched Jaws when I had a day off, and it was a bright summer day, and it was gorgeous. And I was like, this has been on my like to watch list for a while. No one else is home. I'll just watch it by myself. And so I did, and I watched it, and I was like, all right, good movie. You know, pretty spooky. I see what they were going for. The animatronic shark is really cool to see it in action. And like I'd heard about it and like heard about like how this movie was made and stuff. So I was thinking about that while I was watching it. I was like, all right, good movie. And then I was like, you know what? It's a really nice day. I'm gonna go for a swim. Like a dumb. So I went to a lake locally where there's all these other people, and I went and I read on the beach, and then I went for a swim, and I got about halfway out. There's like a floating dock in the middle of this lake, and I got about halfway there, and my brain just was like, I know this is a man-made lake, but like that doesn't matter right now. You can't see the bottom, and so what if we thought about sharks? And I was like, all right, okay. I like swam as fast as I ever had in my life out to the rest of the way to the floating dock, because it was a shorter distance to that than it was back to the beach. I sat on the dock and I watched the water very closely for about half an hour before I was finally like, okay, this is a lake. I can go back to the beach and not be chomped in half by a shark. This is fine. This is ridiculous. There aren't even fish in this lake. This is purely a swimming lake that was made by people for the purpose of swimming. This is fine.
That's great. I love that. I grew up watching Jaws. It's like one of my dad's favorite movies. So like I don't remember a point in my life where Jaws didn't exist. So like yeah, I love it.
I think I just like saw it like once.
Yeah, all the other animal movies, like, you know, Piranha or Grizzly, and there was always like some kind of creepy animal that they were like, you know, that they would like. It wouldn't even necessarily be a creepy animal. They would just make it creepy for the 70s and 80s. It's amazing. I love it. It's so silly.
I think the only like animal one that I would actually even watch is like Pet Cemetery. Like
That's obviously an animal one too. I wouldn't have gone there necessarily because it's like ultimately it's the people that are really bad. Like church is only so bad, you know.
But like the poor animals, like
I was having like the joke that like I'd put my cat in there, she'd come back, and you know if something happened to her, like okay, I'll put you in there. Like you'll only be kind of bad, like you know they you know. Oh no! You're not going anywhere. You're staying. You're hanging around.
Like if animals
like,
are getting attacked, no.
As bad as like Gage was when Gage came back in Pet Cemetery. Gage was obviously really bad. Church just seemed like kind of ill-tempered, right? Like that's my memory. He's just kind of ill-tempered, which cats can just be like that anyway. So it's like in some ways true.
Well, and especially if like they've died and now they have to come back, and they're like, "Excuse me, I was having a nap and I was happy." The hell is this? I'm now mad at you people.
So it didn't come out until '96, but my animal horror story is The Ghost in the Darkness. Apparently, when little Cat was 1 day old, little Cat's father and grandfather decided that they wanted to watch A Ghost in the Darkness while taking care of little 1 day old Cat. So technically, the first movie that I ever saw was Ghost in the Darkness.
I love it. That's great.
And so as a child later on, I couldn't understand why the lions in the zoo made me like a little extra scared. Like I knew that like all like the tigers were fine, but as soon as I saw the lions, I was like, all right, like these could eat me. And I didn't understand it. And so my father told me that eventually.
I think, at least they used to be, I'm pretty sure, in the Field Museum, I believe, in Chicago. So they actually have those lions, I believe. I'm going to check that to make sure I'm correct. But I believe those lions are on display. Ghost.
I wouldn't be surprised.
I would like...
Chicago Phil. So I think, yep, Field Museum. Yep. So if you ever want to meet those lions that terrified you as a kid, like obviously those weren't the ones in the movie,
Yeah.
but you know, it's inspired by, because I was inspired by a true story.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
extra scary.
Yeah, I watched it much later when I was actually old enough to handle it and like understand what was happening, and not just be like, "Hello, world, I am here." Oh, what is that? What is that? So yeah, watched it much later and did enjoy the film, but like it was interesting that I watched it and then my dad was like, "Yeah, technically that was the first movie you ever watched." I was like, "That explains so much." Like, thank you.
That's great.
So yeah, animal-based horror movies. Yeah, wild ride. So we also start seeing more body horror during this period with Shivers, which has been interpreted as a social expression of the fear of sexually transmitted diseases. Which ties into the plot, obviously, and followed shortly by Carrie in a more teen-based horror.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that brings us up to the 90s, which were, they were the start of like low budget found film movies, things like, the Blair Witch Project, which was massively successful, and then just a bunch of people trying to ride off that success.
Yep.
We also start seeing the never-ending sequels and remake after remake after remake, with production companies leaning on the teens that were fans of slasher cult classics that now had adult money.
Yep, pretty much.
And then in the 2000s, we start seeing horror parody itself again as the trends, tropes, they get established, they get kind of run into the ground. So we start seeing horror parodies like Scary Movie, as well as more self-aware horrors that came around at the same time. It's not all parody, but Scary Movie is pretty iconic. So there's also a spike in horror movies where gore is just the whole point of the movie. I call these movies gore porn, a term lovingly stolen from an old friend who used the term to classify movies such as The Human Centipede that exist just for the disturbing thrill of seeing someone else's torture. I realize that it's more commonly referred to as torture porn, but I personally think gore porn rolls off the tongue a little better.
I agree. I actually like it better.
And honestly, straight to the point. That's what it's about with these ones. So kind of it ties back into the same sort of thing with literary horror as as to why people put themselves through this kind of stuff. Searching for the thrill, searching for the spike in emotion. Sometimes, like, we were talking about how, like, it's ironic that, like, people with anxiety would be into horror, but it kind of makes sense because you're putting yourself in this safe space. You know that you're physically practically safe, right? Like, you're in your own living room, you're, in the park on a sunny day. Maybe you're making it a little scary watching your movie in the dark or by candlelight or whatever, but, like, some part of your brain does know that you're safe and is aware that you're safe. So it gives you the experience of, like, exploring these more fearful emotions without actually being in danger. Like, you get that same sense. Your brain can't, like, completely differentiate what's happening to you versus what you're reading or what you're watching, but you are safe. And so it's kind of, it's like a way of putting yourself through that and experiencing those emotions, and like kind of learning how to cope with them and learning how to manage them without actually putting yourself in harm's way.
Yeah.
I think that aspect, like the therapeutic aspect of it, is really interesting.
Do you guys feel that like have you ever had to, where you've started a horror film and then you've had to stop and go back to it again later?
Yeah.
Do you feel like that changes anything for you guys? Because, like, I know I had started watching one, I think it was Dead Silence, with a friend, and we had to stop because my mom's like, okay, it's time, we have to go home, like, you have to come home now. So we had to stop. That night we had a thunderstorm, and I woke up in the night with the thunderstorm. My mom knew, like, there's a thunderstorm happening, she's gonna be a bit freaked out because if I get startled awake, it's bad. And so I woke up, lightning hit, and I swore I saw, like, the main villain's face in my closet, screamed, went flying out of my bedroom where my mom was already coming out of her bedroom. Somebody had forgotten to close the drapes of, like, the really large, like, long windows, and lightning hit where the flash was just right behind where my mom was, and then I saw the person's face but on my mom, and apparently she had to literally restrain me to her bed to get me to calm down, where she's like, you don't have this problem if you've completed a horror film, But she's like, it must be when you have to stop partway through. There's not that completion of the story.
It's the unresolved ending.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unresolved. Yeah. Wow, that's intense.
Like, that was like a horrible night. Like,
Yeah, what are the
I
odds
will
of that?
say though, the movie that scared me the most as a kid was John Carpenter's The Fog, because I was like 5 or 6, and I'd never seen Fog. I'd never seen Fog. I don't know how, like, I'd never seen it. But guess what showed up at my window? My second-story bedroom window that night in the middle of the night.
No.
Most of the time, fog doesn't even come that far up. Usually it's like on the ground. And like, I was already freaked out by this movie. I was so scared by it. But my mom's like, it's fine. It's just a movie. It's all fine. And then like, it's like middle of the night. I wake up. There's just I've never seen fog this thick on a second story window in my life. And I just start screaming, the fog's come to get me.
Oh, no.
And like my mom, I remember my mom's face. It was great because she was just like looking at the window like, seriously, are you for real, fog? Like, she didn't say that, but that was totally the expression on her face. Like, I cannot believe this happened, because she was like, the fog's fine. Fog doesn't, like, it's fine. Like, it's real, but it's not gonna come for you. And it like totally came for me. It totally came for me. And like, it's really funny looking back, because as a kid you're like, oh, of course this happened, right? But now that I'm an adult, I'm like, what are the chances? Those aren't good odds. Like, I'm
No.
well into adulthood now. That's never happened to me since. It's crazy. It's crazy.
That's
that
wild.
out. I definitely cried a lot and was like screaming because I thought the fog was gonna come and get me.
Oh no.
well, like, that is like it's funny how like the circumstance, like just like the freak things that can happen like right after you've seen a horror film, and this is like, oh, this has happened. Like, I used to work in a movie theater, and I remember there was one time where we had both Inglourious Bastards and one of the Final Destination movies showing, and every time I walked into either of those theaters to do the check was a scene where either the movie theater's on fire, or I think in the Final Destination one, somebody was like behind the screen and like the nail gun was going off, and every single time. Like, I didn't even like plan it or anything. Like, it was just like, okay, I need to go do my check now. And I would try to do it at like different times. And somehow every time I walked into those theaters, it was one of those scenes. And then one of the managers was like, hey, like, you're like a super curious person about like how the movie theaters run. You want to come behind and see what's behind the screens? And I'm like, no, thank you.
No.
I have now seen these scenes.
No.
Like, a million times. I do not want to be part of one of these scenes. Thank you very much.
Oh my goodness.
I love it.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Oh man. Yeah, no, the only horror movie that I remember like having to leave partway through was Caroline, like, you know, the children's horror movie. And it's a horror movie for children.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's creepy. And I remember I was watching it at a friend's house, because there's no way I was gonna be allowed to watch it at home. But I was watching it with some friends at a friend's house, and we had just met the other mother and the other family and the button eyes, and it was just starting to get eerie, and it was just starting to get creepy. And that movie plays suspense really well. And like, it was just starting. It was like just before things got like outright scary, and it was that underlying like unnerving, what, we want you with us forever, this is fine kind of period. And my mom came to pick me up, and I was like, I'm never going to be able to finish this movie. This is the way that it ends for me. This is just how it ends. She's there and she's with other mother, and this is how it ends. She's just there forever now in my head. So I still haven't gone back to finish that movie, and it creeped me out for years, to the point where I didn't think I was going to be able to handle it if I did.
I haven't seen it all the way through. I think I've seen parts of it. I'm pretty sure it has a happy ending, right? So I think if you did go back,
It does.
it has a happy ending.
Spoilers,
I think
it does.
Yeah. Like, I've seen memes about it, and I've seen people, like, clips from it showing up on Instagram Reels and, like, talking about, like, you know, there's all these Reels where people are, like, analyzing movies for, like, a short period. So I've seen a lot of Reels like that, analyzing it without ever actually having finished it. So I've seen some of the imagery that's to come, and now I'm like, yeah, that would have been fine. But I've just never gotten around to it at this point. And I really should one of these days just, like, complete middle school Kate's trauma and just, like, let it resolve and, like...
I think there's a really good meme that I saw. And I don't know if it's actually like if it's a true Jeopardy question that was asked, but it was name it was like this movie this Tim Burton movie star was creepy and starred both Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter. And like
Narrow that
the thing
down.
was
Which
basically
one?
like, that's an impossible question to get right because there's like tens of
Which
like at least like
one?
10 of them.
Are there that many? Yeah.
Like
Which one? Okay, did it say what the answer was? Like
no,
which
that's why
one
I'm
they
like I
were
don't know if it's
talking
like a
about?
real Jeopardy question or if someone like made it for the
Can't
meme.
be.
But I was
That's
like, that
gotta
would
be a
be like a
meme.
hard one. Just like every Tim Burton creepy movie has
Like,
Johnny
can we
Depp
narrow that down?
and
Like, good grief.
Aw.
All right, but yeah, that brings us to the end of my notes.
okay, I do want to ask because one of my favorite things with horror movies is now to watch some of like those like B horror movies. So like the ones that you really just want to laugh at, where it's considered horror and they're trying to be like serious about the horror, but you're like, this is horribly done and
Yeah,
laughable.
like just cheesy and bad.
Yeah, like I think those are kind of my favorites in a way because I'm like I can just laugh at them. What do you guys think?
It depends. Some of them are so bad they make me cringe.
Yeah, that's a fair. I feel like that's a fair
Because I'm like
question, right?
one of my favorites.
I like all horror movies, for different reasons at different times. So, like, it's definitely fun to watch.
Yeah, because I'm like I like
Depends
the
on the level of
ones
bad. It
like with
Have a
I
little
think it's
bit.
called Wrong Turn. And it's a very where
Yes.
it's like you got like the weirdest ways to die. Like I think in that one somebody turns into like a human thing of weed where it's like, "Oh, you like to smoke so much weed, I'm going to turn you like basically make you into." Like I remember there's at least one of them, I think it was
I don't
Wrong
remember.
Turn. The one with
Yeah.
Eliza Dushku cuz I'm like I really loved that movie just because
Yeah,
I was
I remember that
Eliza.
movie. I don't remember the. Yeah, it's been a long time.
there was a
Yeah.
movie. There was a movie. Hang on. I can't. This is gonna bother me so much now. There was a movie that was about. It was like a son of the anti. Was the child? No, it was like a son of the Antichrist movie where a woman gives birth to a child that turns out to be the Antichrist, but it's so obviously a doll that it's just like the entire time it's just like a play doll that she's like, the actress is doing her best and trying to act like it's a real baby, but it's like painfully obvious that it's just a cheap doll. And
I don't even know this. That's great.
I
Now I want to know what this is.
I was going through a phase of just binge watching movie reviews on YouTube, and one of them watched it as like a reward for hitting 1,000 subscribers or something like that. This is like in the depths of my memory. I'm trying to like pull it to the forefront right now. But it was just this really, really like cheesy, like so bad that you couldn't even laugh at it bad. It was just like, what is happening? Like, I really,
I
really
don't
wish
know.
I
I'm like
could
looking it
remember.
up, trying to find like what it is. I don't know that one, but oh my gosh, that sounds like
Right?
so bad and wonderful at the same time.
It's like Child of the Antichrist. It's gonna drive me nuts. No, it's not this one. Maybe it is. The Omen?
No, that
You
can't.
know,
No, that
maybe
one's.
the remake of The Omen, I don't know,
Yeah.
but like the original Omen, I don't feel like there's even a baby in it. Like
No.
Damien's like
Damien's
affected
like
by that.
yeah, like he's an
It's-
older kid.
Yeah.
Yeah. It must have been some kind of like rip off or something. I don't know. I don't like.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of like Omen ripoffs after the Omen, like, and then they remade the Omen, and then I think that there were even more ripoffs based on the remake of the Omen. So yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, it must
The
have been something
Exorcist,
like,
like there was so many possession movies totally based on The Exorcist. They
yeah,
didn't necessarily do anything different.
yeah, I don't think I'm gonna be able to pull this out of my brain right now, but like it was something like that where it was um yeah, it was just this wild experience that was just like a whole bunch of non sequiturs, kind of like the scenes didn't really go together very well, and like the jump scares like every 5 seconds because that was the only way any of it was scary at all, and it was like maybe it's
The
good that
jump scares can get so tiring if you keep doing them. Like that,
Yeah.
that needs to be, spaced out. Otherwise, it's just like, oh, good grief.
yeah, exactly. Like it's you lose all the suspense when it's like you have,
Yeah.
something happening every 5 seconds.
Well, and I think in general, like you can get like a tolerance level to them because like for a long time when I actually could finally watch films and enjoy them, jump scares I was like, "Oh," and I actually would jump. And then
Yeah.
it's gotten to the point that I don't even jump. Like a friend of mine who also loves horror films, we saw one at the drive, a different one at the drive-in, and her boyfriend was sitting in front of the car, like he was like, "I'm gonna hang out outside because then he could smoke a little bit, right?" Because I'm like, "You can't do it inside the car. I'm allergic. You need to be outside." So he's like, "Fine." And so he was like in like one of those like beanbag chairs outside, like just in front of the car, and then we were inside of the car. And she was jumping so hard that the car actually moved a little bit. And he's just like looking like, "What are you doing? Like you're trying to kill me?" I'm like, "It's your girlfriend. Don't look at me."
That's funny.
Like I'm like,
Yeah.
"I'm barely moving here." She's like, How are you like not jumping at these jump scares?" As I'm
Like,
like, I'm too used to them now.
Like I'll jump, like I'll get startled and I'll like move and react, but I won't be scared. Like it's yeah, like mentally it's just kind of like, okay, that happened, but like physically it's like, hey, right, nice, thanks.
Like I don't even get that
Yeah.
anymore, and I just kind of miss it. Because I'm like, now I just feel like I'm just sitting here watching another movie where I'm like, it's not the same experience anymore.
Yeah. I don't even remember. Oh yeah, actually, it was a recent one. It was Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Ben, my husband, and I were watching it in theaters together, and there was one particularly scene where something jumps out when I wasn't expecting it to, and I don't know why I wasn't expecting it to because it was pretty obvious. It was like a little hole in a void of nothingness, and it was pretty obvious that something was going to come out of there. But for whatever reason, it really got me, and I was holding his hand, and it just went like, and he was like, okay, okay, let's not do that. I was like, I just no control over physical reaction right there. That just happened. Like, I was like, I'm so sorry. He was like, that scared you that bad? And I was like, no, I wasn't scared. I just reacted. I don't know.
I do that though with Grant, my fiance. I do that constantly. Like if he just kind of like if he all of a sudden just shows up behind me and I'm just like what ends up right and he's like, "I'm so sorry, honey." As I'm like, "Why is it that I can't do this during a horror film, but you just show up like the person I'm living with shows up behind me and I freak the hell out."
Yeah.
Like he's even done it where I'm in the shower and he pops his head in to be like to ask me an important question and I scream. And so he's like, "I'm sorry." And so then our roommate's like, and then our old roommate was like, "Is everything okay? I heard Ashley screaming like bloody murder." And I'm just like, "Grant scared me, okay? I was not expecting him to show up in the bathroom."
Oh no.
The horror of everyday life, the horror of relationship.
Right. Oh man. Well, should we wrap this up? I feel like we've kind of come
Yeah,
to a
there was a lot
natural
of
end.
history. That was great. There was
Yeah.
a lot of great history there. Yay.
Well, I'm hoping we did like share some stuff that you didn't know, Gwen, since you're kind of like the
Yeah,
expert.
definitely. It was also just fun to go back through it. There's some things that I don't always think about that I'm like, oh, it's been years since I've seen that one. So that's fun. That's just fun. Trip down memory lane.
So I guess kind of like to wrap up, Gwen, are you working on anything new right now? Like that listeners can kind of get a sneak peek at or
Right now it's mostly just Reluctant Immortals, just focusing on that a lot and the promotion of that. But yeah, I do have another book that's in the works. That's a haunted neighborhood. It's a whole, instead of just a haunted house, I'm like, let's do a whole haunted neighborhood. So yeah, that should be coming out in the next year or two at some point. I don't have too many details yet, but if you like ghosts and unusual ghost stories, maybe that'll be your thing. So yeah.
Whole neighborhood. That sounds ambitious.
Hopefully.
Just like the history behind each and every house.
Oh boy.
And then also, like, where can people find you?
Yeah, on my website, GwendolynKiste.com, or on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Just look me up, Gwendolyn Kiste.
Awesome.
And we'll put you in our show notes as well, so that people can find you nice and easy.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.